Good morning. Welcome to the UCLA Department of African American Studies first public lecture of the Black Lives Matter Past, Present, and Beyond series. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences here at UCLA. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of this important and timely series. Throughout this ongoing series, the UCLA Department of African American Studies will bring together leading scholars and community leaders to discuss the histories, cultures, politics, and intellectual traditions of the African diaspora with a focus on the continued importance of social justice. Our motto in the social sciences is engaging LA, changing the world, and important discussions like this will aid us as we all try to make sense of the dynamic changes that affect the Black community in our city and beyond. A special thanks to our guest, Dr. Christopher Lebron, for providing what I know will be an engaging lecture and conversation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Cheryl Keys, Chair of the UCLA Department of African American Studies and Professor of African American Studies, Ethnomusicology, and Global Jazz Studies.
Thank you, Dean Hunt. Hello, everyone. My name is Cheryl Keys, Chair of the Department of African American Studies at UCLA, and I'm delighted to welcome students, alumni, and friends to the department's first lecture of the series, Black Lives Matter, Past, Present, and Beyond event of this academic year. Thank you all for joining us today. We are proud that the department plays a leadership role in advancing scholarship and promoting community activism around critical social issues of our times. The hashtag Black Lives Matter protests that we have seen across the nation in response to events of this unprecedented year galvanized what may be the largest social movement in US history thus far in this century. As we continue to address and understand the racial inequality and social injustice that led to this point in history, it's important that we trace the ideological history of this movement and the long-standing struggle for equal rights for African Americans. It therefore gives me pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Christopher Lebron, whose scholarly work has explored the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement. Professor Lebron joins us as an associate professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. His work currently focuses on political philosophy, social theory, the philosophy of race, and democratic ethics. His first book, The Color of Our Shame, Race and Justice in Our Time, won the American Political Science Association Foundation of Political Theory First Book Award. His second book, The Making of Black Lives Matter, A Brief History of an Idea, offers a brief intellectual history of the Black Lives Matter social movement. Professor Lebron is the winner of the 2018 Hyatt Prize in the Humanities, the largest and most distinctive prize of its kind in the US. The Hyatt Prize recognizes Professor Lebron's work as having extraordinary promise to have a significant impact on contemporary culture. He is an active public intellectual, and you may have read his articles in the New York Times, Philosophy Column, The Stone, Boston Review, The Nation, The Atlantic, and Billboard magazine. Professor Lebron, welcome, and thank you so much for speaking today about how Black Lives Matter to Angela Davis and Amiri Baraka. I'm looking forward to joining you in conversation in the second half of your talk. Without further ado, Professor Christopher Lebron.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Keys and Dr. Hunt. It is an extreme pleasure for me to join UCLA community and beyond for this talk today. And I appreciate you all spending your time with me during this current moment, especially. Time is extraordinarily precious. And so the hour you spend with me, I know you could have spent it some other way. The fact that we're here together, I hope to make it worth your while in a deep sense. And I'm already being enriched by being here and in your presence. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share the work that I'm going to share today. Part of what I want to make sure I lay out is today's paper is part of new work that I'm doing for the second edition of the Making of Black Lives Matter book. It's a new chapter. When I wrote the book initially, I put together four historical chapters on running from Douglas up through King and Baldwin. And when I finished the book, I had wished I had more time to add one more chapter. And the chapter I really wanted to add would have taken us into the 60s to talk about a more radical Black politics that comes out of the Black Power movement and out of the Black arts movement. And I got that opportunity when Oxford asked me to put together the second edition for the book. And that's the work I'm presenting today. I want to say that a lot of the work here is provisional. This is the first time I'm rolling it out. So it's something of an experiment for me. And I appreciate you bearing with me as I try to get clear on some of these ideas. And what will happen today is I will end with an idea called soul politics. And we're going to see how that works for us, thinking about the current moment. We're going to do 5 things in today's talk. The first thing is I'm just going to give an overall kind of aim, what the book's aims were. The second thing I'm going to do is just kind of give a description of where we're at today as a nation and where the movement is at in terms of what the needs are. I think about these things conceptually. I'm not a historian or sociologist of the movement in terms of on-the-ground politics. So I speak about the ethical and kind of socio-theoretical mandates that the movement has and what we may demand of it. The third part of the third and fourth parts will be engaging Davis and Baraka. I want to kind of make sure I set the ground for how that's going to go. I'm focusing on both of their early parts of their careers, and for today in particular, I'm focusing on some of the arguments that come out of Angela Davis's Liberations on Lecture and Amiri Baraka's Blues People. I want to try to draw out strands from each of those. My provisional argument is that as I develop the chapter more, the arguments that I'm going to lay out today from these 2 works provide the kind of critical fundamental thread for what the work will ultimately look like. And so I'm going to spend some time today with you kind of laying out that groundwork. And then last thing I'll do, the fifth thing I'll do is lay out the implications of the soul politics. I do want to say I won't have very much to say about specifying the idea. I'm still giving it a lot of thought, and I'm not quite ready to tell you exactly what is in the idea of soul politics, even though the presentation will intimate what might be in it. But I do want to say what the implications are. I am very clear on the implications of a soul politics. And so I'll end there, and then we'll turn over to discussion. So let me begin. I wrote The Making of Black Lives Matter, a brief history of an idea, as a kind of response to a historical moment. As it was well known among many audience members out there today, we have around 213, killing of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Trayvon Martin at the hands of George Zimmerman, initiated a movement to bring to America the problem of the disposability of Black life. And we have Michael Brown in the chorus of that summer, his body being left in the summer heat under the sun in full display. And since those 2 deaths, there's been nothing but a cavalcade of stories of Black murder at the hands of either private citizens and more typically at the hands of the police, the institution meant to keep us safe. I wrote the book because over the course of especially recent American history over the course of American history since slavery was a public topic, movements have depended upon at least some input from the intellectual realm, and often they had their kind of manifestos. We had that with Black Power, we had that with King, we had that going back to Douglas. I didn't see that as much with the Black Lives Matter movement. I wasn't trying to crown myself kind of its intellectual, but I wanted to make a small contribution. And the contribution I wanted to make was both modest, but I hoped robust. And that is just trying to ground what we're talking about today when we talk about Black Lives Matter and putting that in conversation with a deep history of Black radical thought about Black freedom and respect. What we're talking about when we talk about Black Lives Matter isn't only about a demand that the police stop killing us or that private citizens stop killing us for jogging down their street or marching past their house. What we're talking about when we speak about Black Lives Matter is a fundamental claim that Black Americans be accepted into the polity with the full respect of their humanity and the integrity and safety and civic security that brings for white Americans on balance, and some other groups. But Black Americans and Brown Americans have been very explicitly, historically, as a matter of just factual history, we've been excluded from the polity, even when we have the vote, in a very kind of subtle but fundamental and important way. And we've been excluded in as follows. We are on balance not seen as due the equal regard owed all citizens. And that doesn't just resonate in terms of whether our votes are counted. It's actually at the fundamental level, whether our lives, livelihoods, and ability to sustain a livable future is granted the space and security other people enjoy. And without that, Black life in America becomes something often unbearable, hard to endure, or unnecessarily difficult to get to where everyone else seems to get fairly easily, because the background institutions and policies provide that security. The second thing I need to say is that we have the conditions now of ongoing violence. So we need to discuss now what our current moment is. The current moment is one in which we have ongoing institutional violence, but it's also the moment of Trump. And it's hard to have a kind of conversation of this sort without him being a part of it. But I want to actually curb that in the following way. I speak of Trump even as problematic, to put it mildly, as problematic and dangerous as he is as a person. It's important to kind of keep in mind something many commentators have been saying since he was elected, and that he is in fact symptomatic of something in America. And I'm going to put it just that way. He's symptomatic of something wrong in and with America. The ability for racism to be tolerated and gain such wide, now we know, electoral support. The fact that he lost is not especially comforting to me, given how close it ultimately was, all things considered, right? But the moment is one in which we have to now really think hard. And I'm going to bring us back here at the end of the talk. But we have to think really hard about what we can really hope for and how we can think of getting there. And so this is a historical moment that brings with it either the kind of hope of the redemption that folks like Baldwin and Audre Lorde thought we could get to, but not easily, or whether there's something, or whether we have to come to grips with the American project having ultimately failed. I don't know that that's the case yet, but I'm going to end bringing us back to that point. Part of what I want to be thinking about is, as I extend the project, and I want to try and make good on some of the radical lessons that we get from thinkers like Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Audre Lorde, Anna Julia Cooper, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, finally Baldwin and King. I want to try and make good on how we might think, how we might take the thread, the radical thinking in those thinkers, and how we might want to push it even closer to our moment today. And as I was thinking about this, I think both the Black Power movement, what comes out of that era, what comes out of Black Arts movement, was really robust. And as I did in the rest of the book, I wanted to pair two thinkers together. Those two thinkers were Angela Davis and Amiri Baraka. And I want to say it didn't have to be just the two of them, but I chose the two of them in particular because I think there's something in their thinking that is especially rich in helping us try to figure out the question of where do we go from here? How do we actually think about the American condition that we currently find ourselves in? So let's begin with Davis, and in particular her lectures on liberation. What's really interesting about Angela Davis, especially in her early work, was the way in which she was taking a certain kind of philosophical tradition and molding it to the needs of Black folks through the lens of 60s and 70s resistance. In the lectures on liberation, she's trying to get clear on an idea that's been central to political thought since there was such a thing as political and social thought, and that is the idea of freedom. The idea of freedom for her is really crucial for a couple of reasons. One, it is an idea that has real value for living a human life. To live a human life with any idea whatsoever, with any conception of the ability to reach one's potential, requires the idea of freedom in some way, shape, or form. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this or is this not a nation founded on the very idea of the importance of civil, personal, political, and economic freedoms? That is the American promise. And as we well know, that is a promise that was built on behalf of whites, especially white men, in service, well, built by them, sorry, on the backs of Black and brown bodies during slavery. And in many ways, that dynamic has extended. We could talk about that a little bit more later. But this idea of freedom, Davis wants to reapproach it in order to figure out what exactly does it amount to when we think about it in terms of race. It's important to note that Davis is picking up a line of thinking in moral and political thought that goes back from Marx and Hegel, right, up through the Frankfurt School. And that is, she wants to be thinking about the material conditions of freedom. She does this by thinking first of Douglass, Frederick Douglass. And the reason why is very, very simple. Douglass's struggles range from growing up in slavery to attaining his freedom. But there's a dynamic that happens in the course of Douglass doing that. One way we might think about this is that Douglass's life presages his later address on What to the Slave Is 4th of July. And I mean that in the following way. His struggle to become free is the struggle to, in some sense, hold accountable his white slave masters and the ideas that they propounded as being part of the American dream. One way Davis uses Douglass to frame freedom is that freedom is a check on hypocrisy. The idea of freedom is a check on hypocrisy because when we look around and see the state that people are living in, we have to ask ourselves, are we all enjoying the same background conditions being the people that we are? And of course, what Douglass helps us see extremely clearly is the hypocrisy involved in the Coveys and the Thomas Owls of the world, holding on to Douglass as property, even as Douglass is able to conceive of himself. This is the important part. Even as Douglass is able to conceive of himself as a person capable of living a human life on equal terms with the people who own him. And once we think about that dynamic, that his ability, he is able to conceive of a life for himself on equal terms with people that own him, yet that they own him, this is where the idea of freedom begins, right? To be that check on hypocrisy. But notice something else that now happens. Freedom also becomes a kind of personal motivator in a very basic sense. It alerts us to the hypocrisy, but also alerts us to the very real conditions that are in fact impinging on our ability to do exactly what we think we can do. Let me put that a little bit differently. The idea of freedom, once it is in our minds under the conditions of oppression, allows us to see the slippage between the idea of freedom and the practices of freedom. And Davis turns to Douglass's biographies because one of the most significant parts of Douglass, even though he went to go on to live a luminous intellectual career, an activist career, for which we should need to be grateful for what he left behind for us. But it is this moment where Douglass's self-conception meets the rupture in the American polity, in the American public, between the idea of freedom and its reality. I want to highlight here, I keep talking about the difference between the idea of reality and, the idea of freedom and the reality of freedom. I want to highlight here this notion of the idea of freedom, because when we get to Baraka, we're going to have cause to think about what it is we do with ideas and how we purify them apart from practice. But that's just something to put on our shelf for a second. But what Davis is trying to think about is, right, drawing on the Marxist tradition in particular, is a dialectic. And Douglas's life is one way of understanding that the dialectic of the ideational aspect of freedom and its kind of praxis, how we actually put it to play. The slippage there has real implications. And I want to frame it in a particular way. The implications are such that those who are living free, as much as they can use the words freedom and liberty, actually do not comprehend in any kind of deeply substantive way what is required of the idea. The idea is made into a kind of aestheticized, free-floating notion that can be referred to every time they want to talk about what people need. But it's not an idea that actually holds sway in their moral and civic hearts. Because if it did, it would impact, importantly, their moral perceptions of those around them. And so Douglas's role in this piece is to, in some sense, allow Davis to focus on this notion. Let me put it a little bit of a different way. What we get out of the Marxist tradition that Davis is bringing to bear on Douglas's story is that freedom is not a metaphysical idea, right? It's one that is grounded in the very real material conditions of our lives. And being grounded in the very real material conditions of our lives, we are able to take stock of those things around us that allow us to live the way our agency demands, asks us, pushes us, compels us, pulls us towards living, right? But these very real material conditions, they serve as a litmus test for us, for our ability to also gauge the society around us. And is this in this way that Davis, by way of Douglas, says the following in the Lectures on Liberation, that open resistance is the first condition of freedom. I want to just linger here for a second, because if you ask and inquire into the Anglo tradition of moral and political thought, you get nothing like that kind of definition about freedom or its prerequisites. Freedom is something that either is kind of intrinsically good, or it's something that's given to us by governments, or it's a way of governments recognizing something that each of us already naturally have. Davis's flourish, right, here on the idea of open resistance being the first condition of freedom is a practical response to actual history of the Black and brown condition in America, which is to say that even, and what I want to suggest going forward is that even when we have our rights, we may not be liberated. And that's really Davis's, the point that she really wants to push. Even when we have our rights, even if we have our liberties, we may not be liberated because we may not actually be free. I want to suggest something else here. Again, with dialectical method in mind, there's something else that I want to pull out of Davis. Freedom being dialectical, right, means, ironically, that white Americans, even as they enjoy the kind of effective means of their freedoms, whether it be being able to move around the nation as they want, there's a way in which they are themselves in shackles, because the material conditions that allow them to be free are steeped in another group's unfreedom, which is to say that their entire illusion of liberty and freedom, well, let me put it differently. What they think is a reality of their freedom is an illusion, because they could not have the things that they enjoy outside of making someone else, another group, unfree. They are in fact dependent on the subordination of other groups. And this has a profound impact on their own ability to see the very kind of real potentiality of making a society a good one, making society exactly the kind of thing they often invoke when they speak about the founding, the Constitution, and the American dream. I'm gonna leave that right there with Davis, because what I want to pick up from Baraka is now a way to be able to kind of interpret and see, right, the kind of thing Davis is getting on about. So one of the things that we find interesting about American culture, I'm going to shift gears, but just bear with me for a second. I'll bring it full circle for you. One thing we find interesting about American culture, especially when you think a bit historically going to the 40s, early 20th century up to the 40s and 50s, is we have the rise of this thing that kind of defines, in a very deep sense, right, American aesthetic culture and popular culture. That is the rise of jazz music that comes out of the blues. By this point, it's fairly common for us to denote the blues as a kind of art form that harkens back to slavery, right? To field songs, and out of the field songs and the struggles that they express, we get a certain kind of tonality and musical structure that is then given a bit of more formal expression when we get the blues artist, and then jazz music takes its cues from the blues tradition, and then right pushes that tradition in new and somewhat radical ways, sonically, for example. But we tend to take for granted that simply we think of the blues as coming out of slavery, and leave the story there. One of the things that Baraka's Blues People does very, very powerfully is tell a particular kind of cultural anthropology. Now, I'm going to simplify it greatly for our purposes here, so I hope you'll bear with me, because there are a lot of complicated parts in Baraka's story. But I want to see if I get the essentials just so we can move the conversation along. And so here they are. The first thing that Baraka notes is when you get Africans who are brought here as slaves, besides being here in bondage, there's a remarkable cultural rift between the whites who are their masters, the white nation around them, and their own cultural background. Baraka makes a lot of not only the fact that were these people unfree, but they brought with them an entirely different world view. Now we can have anthropological differences as to what that might consist in, what that might look like, but I think just the basic principle that that slaves came here with different notions of social organization, with different notions of spirituality, and also different notions of their own sense of productive power, is already the groundwork for thinking about how those differences reverberate across time. Focusing on the music in particular, Baraka makes a really interesting observation. When we think about the blues as coming out of field songs, which is a proper kind of observation, one of the things we're not thinking about is what else was not happening, right, in terms of expression. Baraka notes that for the Africans who came here initially, they had musicality in their culture, right, from their homelands. But here's what's interesting: they didn't have just work songs. They had hunting songs, they had mating songs, they had marriage songs, they had the harvesting songs, right? They had songs to try and appeal to deities for various outcomes, whether it be for a good harvest or for good weather. But what happens when they become enslaved? Their form of expression gets funneled through just one life purpose, right? Now, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that they weren't capable of having other kinds of thoughts. I mean that functionally their ability, or Baraka means that functionally their ability to now sing. We can't sing about, right? You're not singing about hunting if all you're doing is picking the cotton or picking the harvest for a person who has claimed ownership over your body, right? You're not having village, marital, and ritual songs to celebrate, a new wedding or pairing of a couple, or the birth of a child. Except for birthing of a child, these things just weren't happening, at least not the same ways that they had been. Well, Baraka's point is that when we get to field music, I mean to slavery 1 or 2 generations in, the productive capacities of slaves and their ancestors now is constrained to such a degree that what their expressions is of the hardships or the experience and toils of a very kind of particular experience in America, right? One way to think about it is, going back to the idea of material conditions, their material conditions in many ways, not in a kind of complete way, but in many ways constrain or at least shape what is expressed by, right, this population. What's important here is that what's expressed by this population is itself a reflection of both their political, civic, and economic conditions. And I'm not going in for the idea that it was right. So I'm not going for the social death view that's been fairly well rebutted. But there is a kind of texture to their political and civic and social existence, or non-existence in some ways, that gets funneled through this artistic expression. Here's the next point Baraka wants to make, and it is this. When black slaves and their ancestors were developing new tonalities, right, these songs in various ways, these forms of expression, it was thought as savagery. It was thought as having no inherent culture. Baraka makes a really powerful argument that I want to make sure I can help get across. Their standard for thinking about high art was European high art that often functioned only for its own good, right? There was no such thing as a Beethoven work song. There was no such thing as a Bach, farming song, right? The European tradition of art, thought of in a very kind of pristine manner, was art that existed more or less for its own good, to be enjoyed on an intellectual level. What Baraka wants to begin to intimate here is that the Black tradition, going back to slaves, and then what seeps into the blues tradition, is that the music was functional. Not that it didn't have art to it, but this is important. It was a music that conveyed purpose by the people expressing that music. And in conveying purpose, this was an art form that reaffirmed both humanity but also agency, that took stock of reality, but also was a vehicle for thinking about futurity, thinking about hope, things not yet. That was in concert, that was in conversation with the conditions around them, right? And so when Baraka wants to make this move, part of what what he wants to get us thinking about is the idea of blues and then jazz music as pulling the string, right, of music that has a function to it. Again, not merely functional, it's beautiful and artistic, but has this DNA in it of also telling the story of Black Americans, calling Black Americans to attention about their political social condition, about expressing their woes and their happinesses, about expressing their worries and their points of grief. Last historical point of Baraka. Baraka thinks that an important part of development of the blues and jazz comes post-slavery. Why? Because one of the things that begins to happen is that Blacks had always been suppressed and oppressed under slavery, but when they're set free, they ironically are also the most isolated they've ever been. Because now they are either pushed out of white society, or when they are in white society, they are still clustered through segregation. Right? So there's a way where even their freedom now begins to, in some sense, let them see ever more clearly the nature. And this is an important point. Their isolation lets them see the nature of American society around them. And this alerts them to the kinds of social movements that will get them the rest of the way, leading into the civil rights era, for example. So you have the blues, early 20th century, and jazz music. Then you begin to have the movement, the civil rights movement, and then Black Power. Baraka's not making a claim that jazz caused civil rights era, but he's trying to point out that there was a consciousness in this music, going back genealogically to as a kind of functional, right, as a kind of functional music that actually does serve a purpose, and that is to politically and civically raise the consciousness of a people through its artistic forms. Right. I want to highlight that part by isolation, because now I'm on the last part of the talk. What I want to say about what Baraka and Davis help us see is something called soul politics. And again, I'm not quite ready to kind of outline exactly what is in that idea, but let's kind of think about where we're at historically. This past 6-7 months, we've seen two extraordinary things. One is we're in the middle of a pandemic. And number two, we're in the middle of a kind of second wave of Black Lives Matter protest. That I want to say, one of the important things about it is the incredible participation of white Americans. Those two things are linked. This is what I want to say. what the pandemic has done for white Americans for the first time in their lives is understand isolation, is to understand as a people, right? Is to understand, right, what it means to be in kind of existential danger from their own government. What it means for the privileges of freedoms to be withdrawn precisely because, right, of a situation being both mishandled, mismanaged, and being genuinely dangerous to them. Well, we wonder why it is that Black and white Americans participated so much in the George Floyd and the following protest, right? There are some hypotheses out there. One is, well, people are just bored, right? They're just home and they have nothing better to do. Some people said, more optimistically, seeing Chauvin's neck on Floyd in that casual way was just a bit too much for anyone to handle. I have a different explanation for that. I want to suggest, somewhat provocatively, that during this pandemic and under the administration of a Trump government, in many ways, white people have been living the blackest lives they've ever lived. Think back to Baraka. Part of what Baraka wants to say about the aftermath of slavery and Jim Crow is this fact that this idea that Black Americans lived in isolation within their own nation, by which means say they were simply not accepted. The very premise of Jim Crow is exactly to make sure that wherever civic society exists, Blacks should either have a small portion all to themselves or be expelled whenever they cross that boundary. They are not a part of the nation. They are here, but they are not a part of the nation. And that isolation allows a certain kind of consciousness raising that feeds into the civil rights era and Black power era, right? I want to say that during this moment of crisis, this has been what has happened with many white Americans, that for the first time, for almost all of them, there is this sense of emergency. There is a sense of emergency that arises out of the idea that in this nation is not just a function of them being home, right? It's more the idea of what kind of a nation do I live in which I am here but cannot be a part of the things happening around me? What kind of nation do we live in where the actual idea of the government coming to the aid of the people to keep our civic liberties safe by way of controlling our material conditions, right, are failing radically? That we can actually think about the collapse of a government in the world's supposedly most admired and strongest democracy. And I want to say that in many ways, this crisis, the isolation, the emergency, right, is the impact of soul politics. It is the calling to attention of the people to the dangers provided by their own very social, right, circumstances, by their very own government. And in doing that, I just want to propose that that as an explanation, one explanation for why we see such incredible white participation in the George Floyd murders. Because all of a sudden, and this is the really key point, all of a sudden, the very thing that Black Americans and Brown Americans have known as a social and political fact since the beginning of this nation is now a reality for white Americans. And that is danger and emergency. The fact that the government is not there to protect you, the fact that the government cannot be relied upon, that in some sense that the government, in some senses, maybe can be your worst enemy, right? But now I want to think about this. Let's say I'm right about this. Let's say I'm right that part of the implication of soul politics, right, is the fact that white Americans have been living under emergency, and that is why we are now getting them as, at least for a while, as more reliable allies for racial justice. What does that mean for all of us? Well, it means a couple of things. A couple of them are a little bit foreboding. One thing we've seen over the past number of years is the idea of this discourse, right? We're saying we need to start a conversation. And I've become extremely wary of that idea. It's not entirely clear to me anymore that our ability to persuade, right? And when I say white Americans, I don't mean each and every one, of course. I mean as a kind of stand-in heuristic, right? Our ability to persuade white Americans just by our words has always been an uphill battle and oftentimes fails. And every time we make progress, we want to aim to get this much, but we really get this much, and we call that progress. That's not progress, that's change, right? if it's the case that our discourse and the idea of having a conversation is now has reached its limits, and there's a good reason to think that, how else can we get there? The pandemic has provided an example where it might be the idea that crisis that gets us there. But now here's a troubling thing. The pandemic was a kind of, in part, a natural crisis. We get diseases, but also partially artificial. We get government and kind of formed into this kind of synergistic moment, right? But what does it mean if we say that part of what's needed for soul politics is that white Americans need to, in some sense, be brought through a series of crises for awakening? That might seem theoretically true. I am leaning in that direction. That's where Davis and Baraka are so far taking me. But if that's what is needed, then how do we actually, in fact, do that, right? We don't want to manufacture crisis, but this becomes a problematic kind of a position to find ourselves in, because we seem to need moments of emergency for them to finally understand, in a way, what it is like to live Black in America. So one thing I want to suggest is we need moments that actually, to put it philosophically, offer a moment of ontological and phenomenological leveling, by which I mean the following, and then I'm going to wrap it up here. Part of how we're going to move towards racial justice is that we need moments that allow white Americans to see America for what it is, in the way that Black Americans have, and to then experience the potentiality for emergency in order for them to call them to attention for the failures that have been a real feature of American democracy. The last word I want to say, and then we're going to open a conversation with Dr. Keyes, is this. Without a sense of that failing, right, we can't know as a nation the ways in which we have actually laid the groundwork for the failings we have today. And what the past bunch of months have shown us is that the things that especially white Americans have taken for granted in terms of stability of the nation, actually, this is something that's been in the making for them for quite some time, precisely because there's been slippage between their idea of freedom and the practice of it. And I think learning that lesson from Amiri Baraka and Angela Davis are crucial for thinking about the next stage of how we make Black Lives Matter in America and how possible that will be for the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Lebron, for such an illuminating way of looking at and advancing our understanding through your work about freedom, the idea of freedom, reality, or the practice of freedom. And I find that bringing together two voices, such as from the past, I would say not very, very past, but has been deceased, now part of the ancestors, that's Amiri Baraka, and his words and his thoughts about the significance of music, which is where I come in as an ethnomusicologist. And that's why I chose your book to be quite appropriate, that is, the Making of Black Lives Matter, for my class on African American musical heritage. So I would be remiss to not even deal with Baraka and look at Baraka as he provides us a template for understanding the evolution of Black music as just not in the sense of art, as you were describing from the European point of view. There is the Beethoven of a spiritual, but no, there is a collective feeling. There is a collective feeling of bondage, of a condition that's been expressed through music of African Americans from slavery all the way up to freedom. I also I like the way you treat Angela Davis, although my area is not philosophy in the sense of yours, but I can understand, and I'm sure we all can, that we are living in a kind of facade of what, as Black people, what freedom really is, ideally, and what it really is not. That it's not about law that has provided a certain kind of liberation for Black people, but there is still this, as you say, this dialectic of what freedom can be or is when we think of the law and what it is not in reality. So, what I'd like to ask you, do you see any resonance in the discussions or the philosophies and the ideas of both Baraka and Angela Davis continuing today amongst the Black millennials? I asked that question because I have to kind of harken back to your discussion in your, now we can almost say first edition of Black Lives Matter, making of an idea. When we look at hypocrisy, thinking of that in terms of the what Frederick Douglass, who again, I always parallel Frederick Douglass as being one of those Black intellectual thinkers at the same time, historically, what was happening with Black people being in bondage during the 18th or 1800s and what have you. But where I'm going, we continue to see the resonance of this concept of freedom and the dialectic and the hypocrisy when we think of some Black millennials who expressed their adamant fondness for President Trump, such as I'm thinking about 50 Cent. We look at certain folks from the hip hop community, but we know hip hop has such a resonance with Black Lives Matter as we know it today. When we think of someone like a Kendrick Lamar, but on the other hand, we have those who really, with no shame, espouse their admiration of President Trump, as I mentioned before, 50 Cent, sorry, and Lil Wayne. So I just wanted your reflections, philosophical reflections on this type of hypocrisy as some Blacks have seen this.
This is really interesting. I appreciate the question, Dr. Keys. Part of one of the things that Baraka in particular wanted to when he spoke, in blues people, when he speaks about the history of jazz, is what he thinks is what I'm going to call on his behalf a tragic period. Now is the swing era, and he thinks about the swing era as a kind of tragic era because it is the moment where Black music reaches commercial mainstream and then co-ops a number of Black artists. Some resist, like Count Basie, he praises for having kept the deep Blackness of the blues in his music. He's a little bit less enthusiastic about Ellington, for example, right? And when you think about Ellington's own desire Ellington's big dream was to play Carnegie Hall. That's where he was on the road to. We have to think, well, why should that be the litmus test? And there may be some good reasons. But I mentioned Baraka's tragic invocation of the swing era because I think we're seeing that with hip hop today, where you have an art form that began in the streets, that began in the people, what Langston Hughes called the lowdown, right? The lowdown. It's a lowdown art form that then becomes popular. It has some consciousness raising. You have Public Enemy and Rakim out there really telling our stories, and of course many artisans. But then the other folks come along, and the music industry takes notice, and all of a sudden, they're the rims and the ballin' and the yachts. And look, people can have fun. Like I'm not some old fogey who's like, these kids today. But Baraka's top level observation is that once that begins to happen to the music, the thrust of the howls and screams of the music now just become kind of hollow, right? They just become aestheticized for monetization, and the deep ethics that was part of the music, if it was just for the storytelling, now get co-opted, which is why Kendrick Lamar is an interesting artist, because he's managed to somehow so far is doing both. He's become very popular and well regarded, but also he seems to be keeping the industry at an arm's length, right? So I think of Black millennials, I think that there is something in Baraka that should help alert us to whether they're going through a kind of second swing tragedy by way of hip hop. I want to share another story very quickly that maybe we're looking at the wrong kind of Black millennials. Really quick story: in the aftermath of the Freddie Gray murder, I remember watching CNN. I think it was Wolf Blitzer. He corners this one young Black guy, and I have to describe him because they did it for this reason. I think his pants were low, his hat was back, he had a do-rag underneath his head, he had a T-shirt on, right? A typical Black Baltimore streak. And I say typical how the audience is going to see him. So Wolf comes up to him and says, "Excuse me, sir. You're out here and you're very mad at Freddie Gray, but you're burning down your own neighborhood." And of course, the logic being, why would you harm yourself? But this is what he says. He goes, "You people keep thinking that we're burning our neighborhood. But let me tell you something about these businesses here. They generate tax revenue that we never see. If we can't have it, nobody can have it." And this is a good time to remind the audience, That is what we celebrate about the American Revolution every year. It's that principle. If we can't have it, the English can't have it. And a bunch of white guys got the guns and started a war, and we're really happy about that. The same principle when we speak about this. So there is a kind of critical sensibility, at least among a certain contingent of Black millennials. Maybe we just look at the wrong people. Maybe we need to be taking it back to the streets and asking these people, these folks, just like everyone complained when I listened to the average Trump voter, we're not listening to the average inner city Black youth for the most part, who has something important to say about politics. We think that their hip hop stars are their voices, and I think that's not exactly right.
I agree. Uh, you brought up something about co-optation, and there's a question that came from Dr. Benjamin Doliak, who's a lecturer, actually teaching my class because of my duties as chair, which is the African American Musical Heritage. And he would like for me to pose this question to you. And he says that, just to begin, I really like your use, Professor Lebron, of the word unsanctioned in describing effective radical politics. The essence of radical politics is using unsanctioned means to effect change to disrupt the status quo. But the past summer, we saw an unprecedented mainstreaming of Black radical politics in America, at least in terms of its place in everyday discourse. But at the same time, the optics and aesthetics of Black Lives Matter was co opted incredibly quickly and effectively in advertisements, in the 24-hour news media that Trump calls fake, this is me, Trump calls fake news, whatever, throughout the corporate world, where its message is invariably absorbed on the superficial level of representation and imagery while never addressing core material inequalities. So the question here is somewhat twofold. How does an effective Black radical politics remain radical, remain unsanctioned, and resist co-optation, especially in 2020, when the social media channels and networks through which it is coordinated are already so heavily co-opted and compromised? We'll start with that first question.
So I'm of two minds about this. I think co-optation is itself bad, but I think we also have to realize realities of the nation we live in, which is we live in a commercial capitalist nation.
Right, exactly.
And social culture has its channels. And so when you go out there and all of a sudden you're seeing the Washington Redskins become just the Washington football team, when you're out there and you go to a platform like Kickstarter, and right on their homepage, Black Lives Matter.
Yep.
As cynical as any of us, who think about these things in very high-minded ways can be about, well, this multi-billion-dollar corporation now says Black Lives Matter, we cannot undersell the very real effects that every time a person goes to Kickstarter, every time a person goes to the Nike or Reebok webpage, whatever the case may be, they now have to confront that this powerful organization is at least formally endorsing that message. That's not nothing, right? That's not nothing. And I think it's poor form to say that that purity requires that these mega institutions not in any way reflect what we want them to reflect, which is respect. I think the concern is who we allow to be our spokespersons, who we endorse as our spokespersons, and what we do in the streets. If we merely leave it up to the websites to chant our slogan, if we merely leave it up to the Ice Cubes to be so confused about Black liberation in this way and say, well, because he's part of NWA and they were after police and now he must be right about that, then we're lost, right? So it's a matter of a partnership between these major institutions, but also critical consciousness, which is why I turned to Davis and Baraka, because again, for Davis, it's really important. The most basic litmus test is to figure out whether our idea of freedom is matching with the concept of freedom. And it's very simple. If we think about what it means to be free, and then we also think about what it means to someone like Ice Cube to then say we need to be negotiating with Donald Trump because he knows the way forward, we should be really, really alerted that the basic thing wrong with that, this is also the same person who thinks tiki torch bearing white supremacists are fine people. There's something really wrong with that, right? And so there's a critical consciousness that we must bring to the table to check how our message moves through these channels.
And one more thing I want to say, ask here in your in your work or looking at Angela Davis in particular. Now I want to just kind of isolate and concentrate on Angela Davis. Do you also address elements now in this new chapter, Baraka and Angela Davis, but Angela Davis, about her work on Black feminism?
Mhm.
And of course, you know, I find that her book, Black Feminism and Blues Legacy, deals with that notion of what happens post slavery or during the period of Reconstruction and the traveling Blacks beginning to feel liberated. And a lot of that was expressed in a sense of agency, freedom, and able to move. And with that, you were not regulated to this chattel treatment of sexuality for the most part, in terms of heterosexual sexuality. You know how they threw us in the barns and you had to do what you need to do so we can produce more and more Black bodies for labor. But now we're looking at what happens with women, Black women, and how Angela Davis, of course, deals with the concept of freedom and that notion, which had a great bearing on the lyricism and the expression of Black women during the early 1900s. So I'm just curious if you would also address that in your work on looking at idea of freedom and for Black women.
Yep, that's absolutely. I'm absolutely going to be getting there. I want to steep myself in it. I want to be respectful of that aspect of it, and so I need to steep myself a little bit more into the arguments there. In the beginning of working on that part of Davis's thought, and I've forgotten the essay off the top of my head. It's um, in her volume Women, Race and Democracy, I think is a volume. But she has an essay in there on the irony of how slavery actually, and she uses this as a way to keep us in check. She irony of slavery days being actually the moment where Black women come into a place of authority and beyond slavery for a number of reasons, right? Partly because what the men are drawn off to do, partially because the idea of the family begins to break down. And so now women are now seen as the anchors around which the younger Black children now have to refer to, and they help keep the white households and the Black households going at the same time, right? She has a whole kind of edifice for thinking about this, right? Now, she's not saying this to celebrate, oh, it's a great, that, so it's really, slavery was so great for Black women. That's not the point. The point she wants to be making is that that moment, if we recast it as this moment of Black women's empowerment, we now have to ask the question, how did it ultimately become back to being about Black patriarchy in the way that, you know, Anna Julia Cooper complains about, in the way that Lord goes on to complain, you know, and rightfully so, right? And so there's this moment, and all the while, Black women still being the center of so much of Black strength in America. So she wants to tell this genealogical story that has a sociological, again, underpinnings and real material conditions, and that allows Black women to show exactly how strong and powerful they in fact are. So that's where I'll be going next. But again, to be really respectful to that material, I want to just point that out. Like, I need to think more, because then when you think about the blues tradition and folks like Bessie Smith and the kind of visions of strength and independence that they put forth in music, right? Basically, you know, just kind of like telling the business to both white and Black men in their music. There's a space they're carving out for what we now today think about as Me Too or feminism, right? But they weren't calling it quite that yet. So that story that she wants to tell, and I will be telling that story on her behalf through her work. Yeah.
Well, as they say, we're at the end of our hour. Unfortunately, we got to cut it short. But I definitely would like to thank you, Professor Lebron, for this illuminating presentation and illuminating ideas. And we look so forward to that second edition of Black Lives Matter, the making of an idea. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. And as we're approaching of course, the holiday season, please stay safe and well. Thank you once again. Thank you, Professor LeBron.
Thank you to all of you who joined us today. I really deeply appreciate it, and I also wish you safety and peace.